Hi, everyone. My name's Emily, and I'll be hosting the panel for today along with Giulia. And we're going to be talking about bias in conversational AI experiences. So I know this is a topic that's been talked about a lot, and it's in the forefront of a lot of people's minds. So I just kind of wanted to dig in and get some more information from everyone. So let's do a round of introductions, and then we'll get started. Oita, do you want to go first?
Oh, sure. Hi. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. I am Oita Coleman. I am the project lead senior advisor at the Open Voice Trustmark Initiative. We are an open source community that educates and advocates for trustworthy AI. So thank you for including me in this conversation.
Of course. Leslie, you want to go next?
Hi, my name is Leslie. I'm the co-founder of a bunch of AI startups. I started my first one in 2017 called Humanizing Autonomy. There we built software to predict human behavior for self-driving cars because we felt like that was an under kind of appreciated field of autonomous cars driving through cities without understanding the full breadth of people living in those cities. And since then, I've also founded a new company that looks at analyzing conversations to make sure that people understand what the users of language models are actually doing with those language models, rather than just hoping that everything will go right.
Awesome. Krishika?
I'm Krishika. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Nottingham, and most of my research is focused on understanding the methods that are used in the industry to build conversational AI systems using a socio-technical approach. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you for having me on the panel.
Yeah, of course. Michael?
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. My name is Michael. I'm a design researcher in London, and my interest in conversational AI started during my master's, which I did between 2019 and 2021. And my entry into the subject was looking at accent bias, particularly with automated speech recognition technologies. And I also write and do conference speaking as well, normally around the subject of technology, conceptual art, and all other kinds of things. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here. So I guess the first question I wanted to dive into is what can cause bias in conversational AI systems or conversational AI experiences? I know there's a lot to unpack, but Krish, could you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the biggest reasons for bias in conversational AI interfaces would definitely be in the data set, not having a representative data set to train these models. So I've seen this to be like from my conversations with practitioners in the industry in the past and also recently. I think that is the bigger challenge that we're still grappling with. So definitely if the data is skewed or if the data is not categorized correctly, there's a tendency for the model to learn from data correlation instead of causation. So I think there is that element to consider. Do you want me to add more, or do you want to ask another panelist to chime in?
Yeah. Leslie, you want to?
Good timing for that motorcyclist to drive by. So, yeah, I think training data for me is always the most important one. But then I think there are three more that we need to be mindful of. So one is accessibility, and accessibility can be the design of the system. So even if your model works really well, but like people who can't see so well cannot interact with it, then I still think you have a biased design. And I think you can have that in many, many different ways. So that can be the design of the system, like the user interface, but also in, for example, the language that model is capable of speaking. If your model doesn't speak a certain language, you cut out that part of society for having access to that technology. So accessibility for me is like number two. And number three is the type of interactions that people have with your system. So especially with language models, people can force them into certain corners of society that you would rather not have that technology being used for. So the kind of, I guess, prompting or interactions can generate user-generated bias. And the fourth one is regulatory and ethical oversight. So if you don't have any guidelines on how your system is allowed to interact, or what you deem as ethical use of that system, then it's very hard to evaluate whether there is any bias at all, and also shut down any uses that you wouldn't want that technology to be used for. So accessibility, training data, interactions, and regulatory and ethical oversight, for me, are the kind of core parts of bias in conversational AI systems.
Absolutely. Oita?
Yeah, I think Leslie captured a great number of those things, but I want to piggyback on what the comments around regulatory, and I think that's related to in some cases the lack of regulations or immature regulations as it relates to explainability. It's not just what is happening with the models, but to be able to explain what is happening, and that because as we'll get into, I'm sure during the conversation, some of the issues around the EU AI Act and actually GDPR is users' right to explanation. So so how just the lack of tools or lack of thought as you go into things like choosing the training data, the model design, keeping things related to what I am planning to implement. How am I going to explain the behavior, especially behavior related to bias or inclusivity? So I really want to highlight that.
Michael, anything else to add?
Yes, I think probably building on what everyone else has said, one of the things I've been interested to grapple with, particularly around this subject of conversational AI and bias, is to examine nationality and accent. And I think it's a natural thing when you work with these kind of systems. We think in terms of categorization, very neat categorizations, but actually there is a politics of categorization and how these definitions are created. So, for example, I live in the United Kingdom, which, so compared to America, it's a very small country, but even within the United Kingdom, there are so many forms of regional accent. So if you look at any computer system and you're saying, okay, we want to speak in British English or American English, for example, the question I'll come back and ask is, well, whose English, in one of the talks I've mentioned, whose English gets to be default? Is this the type of English that's spoken in London or in other regions? And actually, the more you peel back the layers, you look at the social and the historical and cultural and racial classifications of language. There's hierarchies that get put into these of, what is professional English? What is English that sounds pleasing to the ear? And actually, it gets more and more messy and knotty as you look into these. So it's this, the question of bias for me is to think of accent and what that means.
May I also add one, if that's...
Absolutely. Yeah, go for it.
I think there's also something called person bias. So when you're building, whether that's models or you're doing crowd work and you have people labeling your data, we have our own assumptions as designers, developers that we bring in, and we also are biased to an extent. So we introduce those biases into those assumptions and into the models and the work that we're doing. So I think that is also something to account for. It's very difficult to detect that, but it's definitely something to consider.
Yeah, definitely. It's worth thinking about it holistically. And I'm sure there's many other sides that one can think of, but it's good to have a starting point. And knowing that these are some of the potential causes, I also want to then pose the question of okay, given these are the causes, what would be the types of harm that having biases in these systems can then create? Maybe we can start from Oita.
Yeah, so I would say there are two things that come to mind, and one is discrimination. As bias is introduced, or if the bias results, could perpetuate and amplify already existing social biases, which will lead to discriminatory outcomes. There's been examples of outcomes with job applications, or with loan approvals. All those things that come into play as the issues of bias comes into play. The other one is misinformation. Is as we experience to some degree, during the election cycle, just the misinformation, disinformation campaigns, how people, you can do some amount of social engineering to be able to get the outcome that you want. And so the misinformation, disinformation campaigns, which lead to negative results or negative behavior or unclear consequences of the actions. Those are the two things that I think are examples of harms that are introduced.
Yeah, both with pretty hefty consequences.
Yeah.
Michael, do you have anything you want to add?
Yes, I think probably to build on that, I think one of the concerns I have is in recent years, this kind of technology, the cost of deploying this technology has come down massively. I mean, we walk around, all of us, with voice assistants in our phones, and the technology is being deployed at scale. And as this happens, I guess the implication of where this kind of technology is used has more of a capacity, for making life-changing decisions about people. Oita talked about job applications. There's been instances in the early 2020s where the German Border Force Agency trialed a dialect recognition system as a way of determining the nationality of what they'd determined at the time to be high-risk asylum seekers. There's also been, many instances of other types of recruitment software that claims to, do sentiment analysis based on the voices of applicants and that sort of thing. So that harm becomes more of a concern when, okay, we go back 10, 20 years, this was very, very expensive technology that only few people could really use and deploy. But now, as a lot of organizations are looking at squeezed budgets and that sort of thing, there's always a temptation to think, well, actually, this is a magic solution to a very complex and knotty problem. And then in addition to that, it's trying to think, okay, well, what is the impact, particularly for people who don't have agency to push back against these systems, to ensure they don't suffer harm because of that.
Leslie, did you?
Yeah, I just discovered, or I mean, not just, but like a couple of weeks, this group called the ML Commons AI Safety Working Group, which is a group of like industry experts, academic researchers, and people in policy and civil society kind of advocates. And they built this approach to measuring AI safety, which I found really, really good, which is called ML Commons, I guess, AI Safety Benchmark. And in it, they describe a bunch of like a hazard taxonomy is what they use it. And I put it next to my screen just because it's quite long. But I think it's really, really kind of substantial. And I'll just name them. So like violent crimes, non-violent crimes, sex-related crimes, child sexual exploitation, defamation, specialized advice, privacy, intellectual property, indiscriminate weapons, hate speech, suicide and self-harm, sexual content, and then code interpreter abuse. And I have never seen a more kind of expansive list of the types of misuses that I could imagine any AI system to have. And I think what's really interesting to their approach is that they're building a benchmark based on actual data. So they're building a benchmark that you can compare your system with to see which of those it might violate. So to me, that's kind of like the list that any AI system should be tested upon in many different ways, both in like pre-deployment evaluations, but also in monitoring and in kind of like red team attacking after you've released it. Let's see who can break it to see if it can do any of those things, because then that's a kind of guardrail that you would want to build into the next version of that product.
Krishika, did you have anything to add?
So I think that sometimes chatbots may have decision-making ability. So or diagnostic abilities, especially in healthcare and things like that. So I think bearing that in mind as well, if it's not trained on a diverse data set, for example, it may not be able to recognize some ethnic minorities having certain conditions and completely disregarding that to diagnose someone who is from an ethnically minor background. So I would say that is also a loss of user trust, and it could also cost a lot to someone who is using that system, whether it's for diagnostics or whether it's for, also like people tend to use ChatGPT quite frequently they almost use it like a Google search. So getting unexpected responses due to biases, again, that could seriously impact user trust. It could impact also the reputation of the organization that's building these conversational interfaces, I would say. So individual well-being. So there are quite a few.
Yeah, that's quite a lot of stuff. Oh, Oita, do you have anything?
No, I was going to just piggyback on the
Go for it.
the brand damage and reputation as organizations. I do think that's important to consider as organizations implement these technologies and ensuring that they're looking at the ethical principles of inclusivity, including biases. What's not just the loss of trust of the individuals who are using the technology, but then what is the damage to the brand as a result of that?
So my question would be, how can you begin to identify these biases, and how do you know if you're just not even aware that they might be happening? Do you have any thoughts or advice on that? Let's start with Leslie. You want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so there are a couple of frameworks for this, and I think one of the more interesting ones is ethics by design framework. And you have some that are specific for ethical AI, and it splits it up into, I guess, 3 parts that to me make a lot of sense from like a technological development perspective. So that's data management, model development, and then deployment and monitoring. And I think in those 3 steps, when you're building technologies, you should implement ethics by design kind of requirements or tests that you do to be sure that whatever you develop is ethical. One thing that we did at Humanizing Autonomy, which I thought was really interesting, was whenever we developed a new feature, so let's say you wanted to understand wheelchair users' behavior, that you actually find a representative selection or sample of society. I think we call it the civil jury or something, where they would be involved in the design process. So they would be involved in, okay, how should we develop this technology? How should we gather data? How should this technology be used in the real world? And what kind of feedback loop should we build into this technology so that it's beneficial for the right stakeholders in society, and not just an idea that some engineers in some back room came up with without considering the impact on the people that will actually be affected by that technology. So I think that's the kind of core part. And you need those 3 parts. So you need the data management, you need the model development, you need the deployment and monitoring from a tech perspective to at least be able to check before you deploy it, while you deploy it, and after you deploy it, and then improve it over time. So that I think from a tech perspective is the approach to take, and one that I've always tried to take with the teams that I've been working with.
I completely agree. I think more companies need to to take that approach. Anyone else have anything to add?
Adding to Leslie's point, taking on a proactive approach, really, and like he suggested, using design by ethics or ethics by design framework. And similarly, I would say there are some useful responsible AI toolkits out there. One of them that comes to mind is the Fairness Toolkit by Giles Lane. So looking at academic research as well, I know that can be a bit of a task for practitioners as well, but there are quite a lot of toolkits which would be very useful to consider, because they help you identify your own biases as well, and also where there might be certain use cases or where there's potential for bias in algorithms. So it's like a holistic approach to assessing that. So that's another thing. And I think constant feedback from users. So you're going to have tests implemented at multiple stages, so getting user feedback. So I think that is also something that we can consider.
Michael?
Yeah, just I don't really have much to add to what Krishika and Leslie said, but I think my suggestion, I guess, is non-technical in the sense of just give people time to read or learn in that sense, because I think in this day and age there is really no excuse for not knowing about the negative impact of these systems or biased data in general. I think the literacy of people's awareness of this is grown exponentially in recent years, and I think it's really important. And I get, for many organizations, there's always a race to get the product out to market if it's a commercially driven organization, and there's always that pressure to sort of get that delivered first. But actually, it's really important that whatever your role is, you do have that time and space to engage with, whether it's academic research. Myself, I like to listen to podcasts, go to conferences, as well as reading. Whatever your mode of learning about these kind of things, it's important to sort of engage with this out there, because for a company to turn around and sort of say, oh, we had no idea this could have happened, my response would be, where have you been for the last 20 years?
Oita?
I agree. Education is so important. And I had an experience with using a text to speech tool recently, and I was generally impressed. And it was when I looked at the diversity of the voices for the output, they had a very rich, diverse set of voices, to use. But what I found is, we talked about earlier about representation within training data, or using, within the product, the diversity of voices or diversity of data. But in practicality, the one thing that I noticed is there are some category of voices, even though they were represented, the performance of it degraded over time. So it's not just important that it's represented, that we have the representation, but how do you make sure at scale that it performs well? Because there are some, basic, voices that we all hear every day. There are no problems that can generate. Maybe I would be happy with the outcome in maybe 2 takes. But there's one category of voices. It took, I would say, almost 2 hours, okay, because I refuse to give up. And it's like, it's here, it should work. But at scale, how do so just making sure that as we educate on how do you go through, and I like what Leslie was talking about, the ethics by design, and we talked about data management, model development, is not just have their representation, but how do you validate that you'll have good performance at scale. And so that has to be part of the education, is not just the training, but in actual usage, how does it perform? And to have something that over time consistently degraded and slowed down. It was consistent. It's like no one actually validated this in use. Otherwise, it would have been evident of the outcome. So there is some degree of, I know it's important that we have frameworks and we have automation in terms of validation, but there's something about human in the loop where you actually get to experience it and give that feedback of, this is not quite what the performance that we really expect. So either the decision of improve it, include more of those in the training, and not just but also pull it if it's bad performance. But then you have to ask yourself, why are we in this situation? And that's one of those good things of the 5 whys. Why is this consistently degrading, to be able to get to a point of what are we missing when we talk about ethics by design? What is missing from our process?
Yeah, and I mean, like what Oita said about the representation of certain groups and how the quality of the data of them affects also how much you can scale that technology. That's extra important in the training data. So if you don't have good quality training data from a certain part of society or a certain language, it's going to be impossible to have the model perform as well on that use case later down the line. But and it makes me think of the Iceland kind of deal I think they had with Apple. I think the Icelandic government paid Apple to build Icelandic versions of Apple apps so that people in Iceland could continue using Icelandic rather than being forced to use English. But the representation of that group was too small for it to be commercially viable for Apple to actually do that effort without government support. And I think that's it's a sad reality, but it's also a good example of where sometimes you just have to do a little bit extra effort and make sure that you are more accessible, even if the company might not do that themselves, like force them in another way to make their tech more accessible, even if that means that governments have to step in and like fund the accessibility of new technologies.
Yeah, and I think on this kind of point, and like something that Michael was mentioning earlier, on like how should companies behave around like knowing, like giving the fact that we know there might be biases, or that we have tried as hard as we can to like get rid of the biggest biases or the most evident ones at least. How transparent do you think that companies should be with users about the potential for bias in conversational AI systems? Michael, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I think we all agree they should be very transparent, but the reality is when you have a commercial product for sale, do you want to be the first company to put your hand up and say, well, I think there's some problematic areas over here that we're not so sure about? And unless compelled to do so by an external regulator or organization, most companies probably won't do that. And I think part of the reason why so many of these issues tend to result in a news story or something going wrong before reparative efforts and changes are made, that's a repetitive cycle. So yeah, I think I know what they should do, but I know the reality of why most companies don't choose to do that at scale.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we all agree that they should be, in terms of transparency, in terms of the use, and that should be. There are some regulations out there related to data usage and model development that asks or that you have to be say how your model is being trained, and some organizations actually require that you do an audit or prove, provide that level of detail of how you're doing it. So I think we all agree that it is the right thing to do. But in practice, as in the commercial market, if it's admitting something, maybe, but we have to also look at it from the positive side. There should be some amount of commercial advantage if you say that if you actually can document how you are going about ethics by design, what you are doing in terms of your model training, your data validation, how you're testing out the deployment. So it can actually, so I want to actually make sure we look at it through the positive lens, that it's also it's a competitive, it could be a competitive advantage to the market if you are able to present that these are the things that we're saying. We've not just that we say these things, but be able to document how you're approaching it and what practices you have in place. I think there's really a good opportunity now to stand above, everyone else, to be able to, as a differentiator. It's getting harder and harder to differentiate on features sometime, but there is that added advantage of being able to compete. Of how you want your company, how you want your brand to be represented.
And what's cool is like you could also do this in an open source approach, right? So you could actually open up a benchmark, create the first version maybe as a company, and then allow people to contribute to see if they can break your system. You've got the Hugging Face benchmarks where you see the performance of different models on different use cases. But I think it would be really interesting if a company would say, you know what, try and break our system, see where we fail. It's very transparent. You will see exactly where we will fail, but then we can use that to improve the technology continuously. So I've yet to see that from a kind of foundational model developer, to actively invite the whole world to try and break their systems and to document exactly where it fails and to use that system to increase the performance of the future models. But I think that would be a really interesting experiment.
Krishika, anything?
I think I'm in alignment with what Michael said as well. It's the extent to which companies are willing to do that. So because it's a commercial product at the end of the day. And even though you may have a level of transparency into how we're training the models and what can be expected, but in terms of how much users spend time reading that, that's also something to consider. Also, maybe doing a test with a small group of users and then a bit larger group of users as to how are they responding to that level of transparency. Because even though we're advocating for this, and I'm also for it, but I don't think all kinds of users have that level of understanding into what does it actually mean to train a model with specific data sets. So I think that's something to definitely consider.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I really
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I really like this point, because I think sometimes it's also like, I don't know, I've been seeing examples of chatbots where it's like 10 different disclaimers in different situations in the UI. And it's like, seriously, like who's even reading all of these things? At some point, you're just ignoring everything and getting into it. So yeah, I like this point.
And on top of that, what Krishika said made me think of like feedback loops. If you don't offer feedback loops into your products, then how will you ever learn how your customers feel about what your technology is doing? I think you need to involve them. And that doesn't just include reading documents before they use your technology. I think barely anyone reads any terms and conditions of any product that they sign up for. But if you kind of gamify it, and you do it continuously, so whenever you notice a kind of weird interaction with your AI model, that a feedback pop-up shows up where you can basically say how you feel about this, or what kind of information you would want to be able to trust that model, or why you don't trust that model, then that could be an interesting way to still enable transparency, but keep it, I guess, more closed into a company feedback loop rather than fully public. So that might be more comfortable for a company to deploy.
So I was curious how companies should handle approaching the challenge of balancing like user privacy and consent with the need to collect this diverse data. And is there a trade-off, and how should they handle that? Michael, do you want to start?
Yes, I think the nature of these systems, in the sense many of them are very centralized, run by very large organizations, there is often a bit of a lack of transparency in that sort of data supply chain, for want of a better term. And two things in particular. I like the approach of developing from the ground up, or community-led approaches. So 2 examples from very different parts of the world. There's Tahiko Media in New Zealand, doing a lot of work in this area to do with Maori language training in conversational AI systems. And the approach they took in that community was to actually keep control of the language corpora, because a lot of companies say, well, actually, let's bring this into our systems, we can expand. But actually, their approach was, no, this is for our community, and actually, if we're going to develop systems, the financial and technological benefit should flow back to the people who've contributed to the formation of these language corpora, which is really, I think, a really important principle, particularly when you're looking at communities who've been marginalized from lots of large-scale technologies. And the other project I really like is called Masakane, and that's an Africa-wide development natural language processing community. Hundreds and hundreds of researchers across all different types of disciplines. But again, building corpora across many, I mean, in Africa alone, there are thousands of languages spoken. And it's that tension, isn't it? There's companies would love to sort of bring this into their environment and expand, but actually I like the idea of building from the ground up, small scale, to actually make sure that you have the benefits of your own technology.
Oita, you wanna?
Yeah, I do think it's the balancing the data question is how, what is the purpose of the data? Only collected, minimal data collection. We all know that that's in theory of only collecting the data that's necessary and provide information on, transparently of how that data will be used, as opposed to collecting as much data as you need to, as you want to collect, because you may need it later, right? It's the minimal data needed to be able to perform the action. So I do think in balancing user privacy and the need for data to improve the models, to improve the experiences, but it really is important that for purposes of user consent, and understanding what their data will be used for, is important that you don't violate what you're saying, whatever your privacy by design principles state, that as we talked about ethics by design, there are privacy by design principles as well, and one of them being, how do you minimize data collection, and how do you incorporate, feedback loop of including users about privacy concerns and breaches and other practices. So thinking about it through that lens, privacy by design, and only collecting that's the data that's necessary to achieve that goal.
What Michael said at the beginning of this conversation about the accents in the UK made me think of your question now, actually, because when you are in a support call in the UK and you're very upset, they will give you a Scottish person, because Scottish people are seen to be much more friendly, or like their accent is much more friendly than, I guess, other accents in the UK. So that is supposed to calm you down a little bit. And in a way, I'm like, that's complete bias. Like, we're being triggered to think that Scottish people are friendly. So I don't think it's a negative bias, but in a way, that's also a system that's not necessarily AI, but it's still a decision that whenever you're upset, you're given a person with a certain accent. And I don't know how I feel about that completely, but I think in a way, this trade-off between personalization and bias is always going to fall back on consent. So like, if you have the consent of a user to use certain data for personalization, and if that introduces bias, I think the user has accepted that they are going to handle or receive more bias. But there's going to be a very fine line between how far you're going to allow that bias to go, with much more risky situations than getting Scottish people on the phone when you're frustrated.
Yeah. I actually have another comment I want to add to that, but Krishika, do you have anything to add?
I think just as we're on this conversation, I wanted to say I do like OpenAI's approach where you have the memory toggle option. So it's almost like saying, I want you to remember the way I interact so that I have better personalization, so I can interact with the ChatGPT much better. Or I have the option to turn it off, and I don't, because I'm maybe cautious about what kind of data is it storing about me, and I don't necessarily always want a personalized conversation from ChatGPT. So I think that kind of approach, it gives the user the option to choose. So there is that consent element as well. And they're explaining what it means to have the memory on or memory off. So I think that's also something that, in my opinion, is quite valuable. There are ways that we can implement this in the interface itself.
Absolutely. So going a little bit back to just the voice bias, I'm curious, this is kind of going a little bit in a different direction, but how, like when voices are chosen for experiences, I feel like they're catering to people's stereotypes and biases of what we expect. How can we break out of that? Like, is it, I feel like people don't choose more diverse voices because they're afraid of losing business because of it. And then we're just reinforcing those stereotypes. So is there something we can do? Like, how do you approach that? I know it's
No, but the example that I spoke about earlier, about the text to speech tool, one of the things that I noticed is the younger voices were, they gave a description of what the voices, would be useful for, or what the market would be. And most of the younger voices were related um, to social media, right? And so it is like, well, that's that may not necessarily be biased, but it's stereotyping, right? And I want, and for the this was for the purposes of doing training. It's like, I would like to use a younger urban voice, but why can't that be appropriate for training? Because they're all people, the training is available to everyone, to a diverse group. So, and so I think in this case, it's an intentional decision that we want a diverse set of voices, to be representative of our brand, if that's who especially for us, as we, the Trustmark Initiative, one of our principles is inclusivity. So we should include that diverse set of voices to make sure that we live up to who we say we are. And I think I think it goes to intentionally making the decision that that's what you want to do in terms of representation. And I think that in and of itself will help with some of the, as I mentioned, issues at scale. Because if you have a list of these are the recommended voices, or these are the ones that are most used, don't select those, because they've got, that is already falling into some kind of stereotype of this is what we're saying. But go outside of that. Just don't go with that. Just push the envelope and see, and have a rich set of voices to represent you.
anyone else?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that this question goes so deep into the cultural history of any country. And I think whichever country you live in, there's always this tension between the type of language that's spoken in the capital city versus provincial cities, the rural versus urban, and all of the sort of positive or negative connotations which come with either of those. And I think whichever role you have in a team is the starting point is asking this question, I think, as a starting point, and really understanding, okay, why have we chosen this particular identity and this particular voice. And it's interesting to me how a lot of times when voices are diversified, it tends to be almost like a veneer, in a sense that the language model underneath is the same, but okay, whether the voice is sonically associated with someone who's Black or from an ethnic minority, but the actual language model underneath is not changed. Yeah, it's quite it's a bit like smoke and mirrors in that sense. And there's a really fantastic point in Ruha Benjamin's book Race After Technology, which is published in 2019, where she relates an anecdote about some of the decisions that Apple made at the time about whether or not they were going to prioritize the development of Singaporean English versus African American English. And you think, well, that's a very easy decision when you think democratically in terms of numbers, which is a larger population, but actually many times the decisions are made for whether it's perceived social or business, what's the term, business, sort of positive association, to put a term on it. So yeah, it's a very deep sociological and cultural knotty question to ask.
Anyone else? Okay. I'm actually I would love to know how, I guess, how do you navigate compliance with regulatory standards that may affect bias mitigation efforts like EU AI Act, GDPR, or other AI regulations? Go
I
ahead.
think you should build it into the technology. So when you're developing the technology, you should keep in mind the policies that you have. You should keep in mind those frameworks. And that should be a crucial part of the design of such a system. So I've actually worked with 2 customers now in which they tried to do that. And I think their approaches there were very interesting. So one was where we added, they provide language model powered feature where you can literally ask anything. So it doesn't have a specific goal. You can just talk to it. And they wanted to prevent those kind of the taxonomy of hazards from ML comments. So what we did there is we added a guard model to the interaction, and the guard model would check whether the input or the output of that model would validate or violate any of those kind of topics of hazardous interactions with the language model. So actually there was another model checking whether the original model was doing anything that it wasn't supposed to do. So that's one way to build it in. And then the second way was to actually match the interactions with the terms of use of that technology. So in that case, the company had terms of use that was very kind of strict, and certain things people were not allowed to do with that language model. So what we did is we had another model checking whether the interactions that users had with that language model were violating the terms of use. And basically, when you update terms of use, it would automatically update the language model. So you would immediately check whether the new terms were being broken or not. And I think those are ways in which you can let the technology use its power on itself, which is much more powerful and much more scalable than having humans sample it and having humans check whether it's doing the wrong thing or not. So I think that's a very interesting kind of new approach that, for me personally, I've only been involved with over the past 2 months. But I think there's a lot of potential there, especially since the kind of the power of those technologies is only going to grow and is only going to get faster. Why don't we use it to check up on itself?
Do they have humans in the loop for that? Like making sure that the model, okay.
The model then flags and like creates a quantitative evaluation of like, oh, how frequently does this happen? Who is doing this? What organization is doing this? What exactly are they using it for? So that then you can either kick that organization off your platform or take further action that you might want to do on things that are really bad.
Anyone else have?
I want to use this opportunity to plug a training course that we are developing, a Digital Smart initiative, and it's to actually address the question you asked about the complexity of all of the regulations. There's the EU AI Act, there's a NIST AI Risk Management Framework, there's ISO 42001. So we have a course that will be launched next month that is making sense of that. So it's looking at is reviewing each of those frameworks, and then it's looking at what are the commonalities across. They're using different languages, they're using different taxonomies, but at the core, what's the low-hanging fruit that organizations, individuals should know to be able to look at these diverse set of regulations. One, for example, EU AI Act is mandatory. And then there's this AI risk management framework and ISO that are more best practices. But there's a marriage of the two, that if organizations can just understand the commonalities and what's the low-hanging fruit to help streamline their efforts to understand each of those and what are the benefits. So and at the end, it will give some just actionable steps that you can do to be able to achieve the goals that are outlined in each of those. And it's geared specifically towards conversational AI. So look for that, the work that we're doing there at Trustmark Initiative. That is, of course, that we think would be very helpful and useful to organizations to just have a basic education and understanding of those.
And just for anyone, I know there have been a lot of resources and stuff mentioned, so we'll try to collect all the links and then drop them in the chat, just so everyone has the references handy. Krishka, Michael, anything?
I wanted to add that I think, from my perspective at least, when we're talking about implementing regulations, EU AI Act, GDPR, they're already advocating for minimizing the risk of bias, minimizing the risk of safety, privacy issues. They're already addressing these. They have potential to actually make conversational AI a bit more safer to use in that way, because there are obviously implications of biases and so on that we've already addressed in this discussion earlier. So it's about how you do it at the end of the day. And I think there's a little bit of flexibility as well in terms of how companies approach these regulations themselves. It's really upon them. So yeah, that's kind of what I had in mind about it.
Thank you. Yeah.
I mean, I think I must admit, this is not my area. So I think my advice is, if you feel like you don't know, admit it and ask people who do know much more. And I think I've got 5 people that I can ask in this scenario. So I think that's the lesson in so much of tech. We always have to put so much pressure on ourselves. We've got to know everything, but actually hold your hands up and say, I don't know, and find people who do know more than you and bring them into the process.
I guess I know we're coming up on time here. Giulia, do you want to ask one more question?
Yeah, I had kind of a more perhaps controversial, I don't know, we can take it where we want to take it. And I guess it's a good one to end on as a maybe takeaway for people who are listening. When I thought about the topic of this panel, I immediately started thinking about this example we had. I don't know if it was this year, last year, I can't remember anymore, but with Google, where we started at some point, they released this new image generation model where we started getting pictures of racially diverse Nazis or things like that. So I'm curious to hear, what is your take on this? Do we appreciate that Google had the forethought of, okay, maybe this could have some biases, so just put something in the system prompt to kind of maybe generate more racially diverse images? Or do we think a shortcut on bias, on ethics, is still a bad thing?
I think from my point of view, I mean, it does blow my mind that you're developing systems that can basically make a picture of absolutely anything you write into it. So how on earth are you supposed to test that? And I just feel like these kind of things are just going to be happening more and more, because if you go back to, in the simpler days, you're developing a very simple piece of software to do one or two very narrowly defined things. But I mean, it continues to blow my mind when you think of these systems that you either speak to or type to that can just do absolutely anything you say to them. I have no idea how you can test all eventualities of that.
Yeah, I think it's very hard to know upfront all the crazy use cases that people are going to try this model for. For that particular example, I would have said, like, you don't have to be too creative to imagine what kind of weird stuff people would ask from an image generation model. So I would have said that should have been in an evaluation test set before deploying that model. And it might have been in the evaluation test set, and they could have just said, like, okay, well, yeah, very unlikely that anyone might do that. But then it did bubble up. But yeah, to me, I don't think there's a clear decision that you could ever make on beyond all of the tests that you've done and all of the risk assessments and all of the data privacy assessments that you can do that say that it might be risky, that there is always going to be something that you will have missed out on. And that's why the monitoring is so important. And I think it was actually Microsoft that had an issue with their first language model. I think there was a Twitter bot or something that suddenly became very racist. And it took them quite a while to take it down. And then on their second release of that bot, they were very quick in taking it down and immediately adding a guardrail. So I think that's probably the way to go. Like, just make sure that whenever you deploy a technology that scales as quickly as this, to also know how to shut it down very quickly and to iterate on it very quickly. So I think that's really the only way to deal with these kind of situations.
Oita?
I guess the thing for us to remember is at the core that we as humans are developing this technology currently, and there's this legal concept of the reasonable person rule, and that is, it's a legal standard to determine whether a person's behavior is considered appropriate or acceptable under circumstances. How do we apply that reasonable, person rule to technology? Do we expect that same level of, if it, there's an American term, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck, they're reasonable if we think it's, we think it may be violate ethical principles of bias, if then, we should say something, or maybe it's not something you want to implement. So I think to some degree we have, again, we as humans, as developing this technology, there's things in just basic looking at and making decisions on, is this reasonable? And then in medical situations, we have the precedence of do no harm and duty of care. How do we start implementing those type of ethical decisions and or that perspective in how we develop the technology?
Krishika? Anything?
Yeah. So I think it goes back to recognizing that the AI models do have generative capabilities. So there's only to a certain limit that we can, kind of expect what kind of output it's going to generate, unless we kind of constrain it to generate specific outcomes. That outputs, I mean. And the other aspect is, I know that having spoken to practitioners in the past, again, there have been challenges with what can we suddenly expect a user to key in. So this was probably not the intended purpose of using, a generation of images, but people came up with ideas and they used it. So definitely, in alignment with what Michael and what Leslie said, that we don't know what to expect, and we will have such challenges that keep happening. So to be able to shut it down as quickly as they did, I think it's kind of nice that they had that ability to do so.
Absolutely. And we have one last question. I might have you put this in the chat. If you know, and if there's a prompt library pertaining to bias, if we don't have the resources to train models, we can at least tackle it at system prompts level, and it would be great to see a library of those prompts. So if anyone does know, definitely drop it in the chat.
I
Thank
think
you.
also related to this last topic we have, for anyone who's interested, we had a panel on red teaming for conversational AI. And we had quite a few people there that are doing this as a job. So it was super interesting for me. Like, I learned a lot on that panel. So if you're interested in the topic, I would definitely recommend to go back, and I'll link it here below.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, I know we're at time, so thank you all for being here. This was really fascinating. I've definitely learned a lot. So yeah, thanks so much, and stay tuned. We have a couple other panels coming up, so we'll send some announcements about that. And yeah, have a great day, night, evening. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you all.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thank you.